حبوبي بالوصال أنعم علي وجد.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم أجمعين. سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم، ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. Alhamdulillah. We will continue our study of this blessed book, Book 1 of the Ihya ʿUlum. And this particular session is one of the most important, because in it we will take a look at what is considered to be the thrust of the entire Ihya ʿUlum. And in fact, the project of Tajdeed of Hujjat Islam al-Ghazali in the post-Nizamiya phase of his life. This is right at the heart of all of the books that he wrote. The most important of which lays the foundations for the others, is this blessed book that we have before us of Ihya ʿUlum. And so we will be looking at what is called ʿIlm Tariq al-Akhirah. And you could spend an entire session on the title itself, the name that Imam al-Ghazali chose for it, and how masterfully he combines the diverse sciences that he was knowledgeable of, and seamlessly presents this blessed conception of the deen that is in some ways synonymous with beneficial knowledge at its core, but it's not just that. It's also a methodology. And the methodology that is intended by the understanding of Ilm Tariq al-Akhirah is something, as we will see, it is applicable not only in terms of our approach to the deen, but also in every other aspect of our lives. So this is really important. And this is likely, if you look at some of the great traditions like Sadat and Ali Ba'alwi, who appropriated this blessed book, and it became a staple part of their tradition. This was one of the great things that attracted them, this understanding. And this understanding in Tariq al-Akhirah will help you understand the details of what Imam al-Ghazali says throughout the entire Ihya, and many of the other books that he wrote after that, including books like Bidayat al-Hidayah, including books like Jawahir al-Quran, and including books like al-Arba'in al-Asl, and a number of others as well. So this conception composes of three words. So first you have ilm, and by now I think we all know, or at least have a general idea of what is meant by ilm here. Then you have this word tariq, and a tariq is a path or a way. And then you have, of course, the word al-akhirah, which you could translate as the afterlife or the hereafter. So ilm, tariq, al-akhirah. Now, it's probably better to translate here ilm instead of knowledge as science, because science points more to systemization. And so that Imam al-Ghazali is one of the great systematizers, and that essentially when he's using this term, he is pointing to a systematical approach to the deen. And we'll get into that when we'll offer some potential definitions of what this science really is. But if we go back to Imam al-Ghazali's introduction, so yesterday we had quoted the first bit, and Imam al-Ghazali gets right into his critique and his diagnosis of one of the core problems during his time, which incidentally is that just as relevant in many ways today as it was then. And towards the end of that, we said that Imam al-Ghazali says, وَأَمَّا عِلْمُ طَرِيقِ الْآخِرَةِ. So this is where he first introduces Ilm Tariq al-Akhirah, is right in his introduction. وَمَا دَرَجَ عَلَيْهِ السَّلَفَ الصَّالِحِ. And the way of the righteous forebears before us, from that which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala termed in his book fiqhan wa hikmatan wa ilman wa diya'an wa nuran wa hidayatan wa rushdan. We quoted that yesterday. Allah Ta'ala calls this way in His book, understanding, wisdom, knowledge, radiance, light, guidance, and so forth and so on. He says that this has become something that is forgotten. And so He introduces us right off the bat. So you have, on one hand, a mentioning of the Ihya al-Din, which becomes the title of the book, even though when he uses it in this first sense, he's talking about the act of reviving the sciences of the deen. Here, he introduces as well the ilm tariq al-akhirah. And we're actually going to come back to where he will then say, when he lays down the structure, the Ihya al-Din has a defined architecture. It was chosen very carefully. And each quarter has a specific meaning. Rather, each book in each quarter has a specific meaning, and it is directly tied to the natural breakdown of the sciences of what he himself terms ilm tariq al-akhirah. So nothing is out of place. He knew exactly what it is that he was doing, and everything was intentional. So the Ihya has an architecture, if you will, and that it serves the purpose of him writing about this principle of ilm tariq al-akhirah. So we'll come back to some of those details of the breakdown of the 4 different quarters. Yani each quarter contains 10 books. But he then goes on to say later, but also in his introduction, when he says that based upon this reality of ilm tariq al-akhirah and the structure that he's proposing for this blessed book, he says that this is something that is natural and almost necessary. And the reason is that when you speak about ilm tariq al-akhirah, it has the natural breakdown into 2 different types of knowledge. And Sidi Abbas had that indicated one of them in his previous session. But ilm tariq al-akhirah breaks down into ilm al-mukashafa and ilm al-mu'amala. And ilm al-mukashafa, there's a number of different ways that you could translate that, but essentially this is the knowledge of unveiling. Whereas ilm al-mu'amala is knowledge insofar as it relates to our dealings. And the difference between the two is, in terms of ilm al-mukashafa, ma yutlab minhu kashf al-ma'lum faqat. What is intended by it when it comes to ilm al-mukashafa is only the disclosure of what is known. But when we talk about ilm al-mu'amala, our dealings, and of course that mu'amala could be with Allah, in such that it takes the form of worship, prayer, salah, fasting and so forth, or that mu'amala, those dealings could be with people. When we talk about ilm al-mu'amala, that in addition to the disclosure of what is known, you include with that action, putting something into practice. Okay, so you have ilm tariq al-akhirah. We're going to translate that as the science of the path to the hereafter. And the first breakdown then is, it breaks down into ilm al-mukashafa and ilm al-mu'amala. So ilm al-mukashafa is the knowledge of unveiling. Ilm al-mu'amala is the knowledge of dealings. And the difference between those two is, when it comes to ilm al-mukashafa, what is intended by that is the disclosure of what is known. It's a more experiential type of knowledge, whereas when we talk about ilm al-mu'amala, was intended to know that thing, but also to put it into practice. Now, the next thing that Imam al-Ghazali says here is the following, and this is a quote. He says, the purpose of this work, yani the Ihya, is only ilm al-mu'amala, the more practical knowledge, not ilm al-mukashafa, not the knowledge of unveiling, which there is no permission to place in books except with the rarest of exceptions. Even if it is the ultimate aim of seekers and the highest aspiration of the Siddiqeen. So this is very important. He wants us to know that there is a type of knowledge that is sought for in and of itself. And in everything else is a means in order to attain that. And this is very important because one of the greatest problems that blocks people in the spiritual path, as well as, by extension, the Ummah of our Prophet ﷺ, is taking means as ends. And in a worldly, you could divide things into means, worldly ends, and then ultimate ends. So the ultimate ends are things like entering into paradise. These relate to, when we talk about sincerity, the 5 overarching intentions that you make for every act that you do. You want to have it be a means for you to enter into paradise. You want to receive the reward for what you did in that particular act, and by extension, your life. Then you want to draw near to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You want to attain His contentment and gaze upon His noble countenance. These 5 intentions are intentions that relate to the ultimate ends of everything. And then you have worldly ends, yani things that in and of themselves, they're ends, but in a worldly way. So things like tahqiq al-ubudiyya, establishing your servitude. Things like being a true representative of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here on earth, i.e. that being in alignment with the divine will. Things like good character. These are ends in and of themselves. In other words, regardless of the consequences, and you can't say that, oh, that if I would step out of line here and act with this character trait in this situation, it would actually be better for me because this might happen. No, you have to do what is right. So honesty is one of those examples. And even if it leads to consequences and you getting fired, it's better that you're honest than to lie and fall into sin. It's better to be honest. And usually, when you do that, Allah Ta'ala takes care of you anyway. But then you have means. But the whole point here is, all means and all worldly ends are ultimately there to prepare us for the ultimate ends. And the ultimate ends, the only thing that you can really say about them here in this world are these glimpses that the vast majority of people get. As for the people of Allah Ta'ala, they are living in a way where there is something of the paradisical reality of the hereafter brought forth for them because of their knowledge of Allah. But ultimately, it is centered around that knowledge of Allah and love of Him. And this is really the whole goal. This is the purpose of life, is to know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he says here, this is the ghaya of the maqsad al-talibin wa matmah nazar al-siddiqin. So this is important. He wants us to be very clear what it is that we're aiming towards. Everything that we do in life, from prayer to all of the other acts of obedience, that everything that we do in relation to other people, giving people their rights, having good character, all of these things ultimately lead to this reality. Yani, witnessing something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala brings to the heart from His bounty. And so this is what they seek, and this is why he frames it, says it in this way. It's the ultimate aim of seekers and the highest aspiration of the siddiqeen, the highest saints, or however you choose to translate that. In other words, ilm al-mukashafa is something that we should be aware of. And it's not necessarily something that we do other things for. There's a subtlety there which can be discussed in its time. But it's a fruit that Allah Ta'ala gives as a result of people doing their part in order to attain it. But then he goes on to say here, the prophets, peace be upon them, only address people with knowledge of the path. So, وَلَكِنْ لَمْ يَتَكَلَّمْ إِلَّا صَلَوَاتُ اللَّهِ عَلَيْهِمْ مَعَ الْخَلْقِ إِلَّا فِي عِلْمِ الطَّرِيقِ وَالْإِرْشَادِ إِلَيْهِ. What is the path to this knowledge? As for ilm al-mukashafa, they only refer to it with allusions and subtle indications in a symbolic and general way. So this is, of course, the words of Imam al-Ghazali. Knowing that people could not bear the meanings with their limited understanding, since scholars are heirs of the prophets, they cannot but follow their example and emulate their way. But if you follow the path, Allah Ta'ala will bless you with this. So when you read about all of these amazing things that the people of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala attain, and that throughout the course of history, different authors divulge different aspects of this. All of this and more was there in the companions of the Prophet ﷺ. This was all there. It just wasn't articulated until a much later period. And just you get these glimpses, and even those glimpses are just that drops in the ocean of the reality of what it is that they experienced by being in the presence of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So then here he goes into the division of ilm al-mu'amala, which we're going to pause here and that we're going to come back to bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. But we're going to start with, we're going to just mention very briefly what Imam al-Ghazali says about ilm al-mukashafa, to that in a way that encourage people to know that this exists. Although once he introduces it, then he quickly goes back to the ilm al-mu'amala. Okay, but this is what you need to focus on. However, the Ihya has this incredible feature, which you could term it different things. And the Arba'in al-Asl, Imam al-Ghazali calls it the rawa'ih al-ma'rifah, sense of gnosis, that he weaves into this book, oftentimes by way of tangents. And in most of the books of Dawah you find this. And you can call it a mystical thread, however you choose to refer to it. Some of them have categorized the various topics that he discusses when he does this. But what it does is it encourages the reader, as you're going through this arduous process of learning what you need to do and then to actually do it, it reminds you like, oh, this is what's going to come if you do this. Oh, these are the type of insights that you eventually get if that you're patient. And it's a very beautiful feature of the Ihya. And what he does though then in the chapter after he mentions the merit of knowledge, teaching, and learning, and this comes shortly after the discussion of the Fard Ain and the Fard Kifaya, and then the section that Shaykh Yasser covered yesterday, where he was breaking down the classification of the sciences and relation to the usul and the furu and so forth. Then he preempts someone's question. Okay, you've spoken about ilm tariq al-akhirah. You have mentioned its importance. So, fassalli. So, tell me in detail, what is this ilm tariq al-akhirah? So that I can understand it. And he again says here, and he repeats, that it's of two divisions. Ilm mukashafa and mu'amala, which we've already spoken about. But then he wants us to know in general, when we speak about ilm al-mukashafa, what is it? And this is of importance because it's good to know that this exists. So again, he repeats once again, وَذَلِكَ غَايَةُ الْعُلُومِ. This is the greatest knowledge that can be attained. This is it. This is the end, if you will, of what we attain by way of knowledge. This is the goal. And so it's a long quote here, but I will mention it. And he says it's the ghayat al-ulum. And then he says it's the knowledge of the siddiqeen and the muqarrabeen, of the highest saints and those near to Allah. And as Sidi Abbas mentioned, he says there, it is a light that appears in the heart. When it is cleansed and purified of blameworthy traits, through that light, certain matters are unveiled that previously one used to hear the names for, and then general meanings for them were imagined without clarity. Then they become clear, such that true knowledge is attained of the essence of Allah, His eternal and perfect attributes, His acts and His wisdom in creating this world and the hereafter, and His preference for the hereafter over this world, and knowledge of the meaning of prophecy and prophet, the meaning of revelation, the meaning of the expression angels and quote devils, how Satan wages war against mankind, how the angel appeared to the prophets, how revelation comes to them, knowledge of the dominion of the heavens and earth, knowledge of the heart and how the hosts of angels and devils clash therein, knowledge of the difference between an angelic suggestion And a demonic suggestion, knowledge of the hereafter, the guard and the fire, punishment in the grave, the traverse, the scales, the reckoning, and the meaning of the words of Allah, sufficient is yourself against you this day as a reckoner. And the meaning of His words, and indeed the home of the hereafter, that is the true life, if only they knew. And the meaning of encountering Allah and beholding His noble countenance, the meaning of proximity to Him and residing in His presence, the meaning of attaining happiness in the company of the highest assembly and association with the angels and the prophets, the meaning of the diverse degrees of paradise's inhabitants to the extent that they see one another there as one sees a shining star in the sky. And beyond all this is that which would entail a lengthy explanation. And when the scholars speak of this science, that one of the Habaib, Abu Bakr bin Abdullah Attas, he used to say, لو تكلمت على ذرة من علوم الإيمان لعجزت كتبت الدنيا. Were I to speak about even the smallest bit, an atom's weight of the knowledge of Iman, meaning these signs, this knowledge of unveiling, that the world's scribes would not be able to write down what it is that I would say. So this knowledge is an ocean. And so when he says this, and beyond all this, there is that which would entail a lengthy explanation. And what we get when you spend time with the true people of Allah, you just get these glimpses. You get that blessed gems. And sometimes you have to wait a long time to hear that. But they have an incredibly strong impact upon you. Even if you only get 5 or 10 of those gems your entire life, it's the most precious thing that you have, are those gems. Because those, especially that if you take them from living inheritors of this tradition, it's the closest that we're going to get to Ayn al-Yaqeen or Haqq al-Yaqeen, even though we're far from it and we're trapped in Ilm al-Yaqeen. There's 3 degrees of certitude. And the lowest relates to certain knowledge that we have, but then the latter 2 are more about experience. And Imam al-Ghazali says is that it's possible, and this relates to his whole ethical theory, if you will, that breakdown of how we can move up on what are called the maqamat al-yaqeen, the stations of certainty. Here things are different than the normal breakdown of ilm al-had. Here, that there's a special type of knowledge that comes from knowledge that you've known and put into practice in the state that then bequeaths, that it leads to another type of experiential knowledge, that those stations are built upon. And the closest that one can get is when someone moves up in that degree and they're so close to these blessed inheritors, is that certain things spill over, and it's as if that they're experiencing it due to their proximity or not. They're the ones experiencing it, but you're so close, it's as if that you are. Because you know they're people who tell the truth. You know they're people of piety. And this is why this is one of the greatest ways of all to solidify your faith, is to be close to the people of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to witness the wonders of what it means to have Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala take over your affair. And it's hard to put into words, but when you travel with them, you will experience this. You will see the way that Allah arranges things for them. You will see things that happen. You will feel that there's like this protective bubble around you, that when you're on your own that you don't feel it, or at least not to that same extent. And hakala. And that this is exactly what it means. And there's different ways of breaking it down, but the wali is the one who tawalat ta'atuhu. He is someone that continuously been in a state of obedience. And then the result is فَتَوَلَّ اللَّهُ أُمُورُهُ. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has taken over that person's affairs. The manifestation of which is كُنْتُ سَمْعُهُ لِيَسْمَعُ بِهِ وَبَصُرُهُ لِيُبْصِرُ بِهِ. I will be the ear through which he hears, and the eye through which he hears, and through which he sees, and hakala. If Allah Ta'ala has taken over your affairs to that degree, then what would you expect from someone like that, anything other than what is truly amazing? So he then goes on to offer one other final wisdom on a little bit down in the same chapter, where he says here, we mean by ilm al-mukashafa, that the cover, so now he's explaining more about actually what happens. We mean by ilm al-mukashafa that the cover is raised, and yartafa al-ghita, yani the ghita literally is a cover. The cover is raised, yani the veil is lifted, until the evident truth in these matters manifests itself as clearly as if it were seen by the eye, leaving therein no doubt whatsoever. And so just very quickly, if you look at, there's numerous statements of our Prophet ﷺ to do ta'sil and understand this in the life of the companions themselves. There's a beautiful hadith, and I encourage you to look it up in Sahih Muslim. But it's in the context of the Ahruf al-Sab'a, the 7 modes of recitation of the Book of Allah. Ubay ibn Ka'b, who was one of the great reciters of the Quran, he hears a companion reciting in a way other than he learned from the Prophet ﷺ. And then he heard someone else reciting in a way other than he learned. So he takes both of them to the Prophet ﷺ. And that he tells the Prophet essentially, in summary, that about what happened. And the Prophet had both of them recite, and then deemed both of their recitations to be correct. And then Ubay says that I started to doubt the way that as if I was in the time of Jahiliyyah. And then he says, when the Prophet ﷺ saw what had overtaken me, لما رأى ما غشيني, that فضربني بصدري, that he hit me, and it's in Sahih Muslim, he hit my chest. And he said, فَفِضْتُ عَرَقًا, I started to profusely sweat. Then he says, فَكَأَنِّي أَنظُرْ إِلَى اللَّهِ فَرَقًا, and it was if that I was looking at Allah clearly. The Arabs say, كَفَرَقَ الصُّبْحِ and كَفَلَقَ الصُّبْحِ, like clear as daybreak. He says, فَكَأَنِّي أَنظُرْ إِلَى اللَّهِ فَرَقًا, as if that I was looking clearly at Allah. That's what the hadith says. Yani the Prophet ﷺ hit his chest, boom, the veil was lifted, khalas, immediately. And he attained the highest degree of certainty instantaneously. And there's many other examples of that. The famous one is that Haritha, how did you enter into this morning? How did, there's multiple narrations. Oh Messenger of Allah, I've become a true believer. Oh, listen to what it is that you're saying. That every word that you say or every truth has a reality. What is the reality that of your faith, oh Haritha? And he started to describe to him. And he says, Azivat nafsi an dunya, I've turned away from this world, that gold and dirt is the same to me. But then he goes on to say, فَكَأَنِّي أَنظُرْ إِلَىٰ عَرْشِ اللَّهِ بَارِزًا. And the ka here is important. This is the ka tashbih. The ulama speak about it in detail. But it is as if that I am looking at the throne of Allah right before my eyes. It is as if that I'm hearing the people in paradise enjoy the blessings of paradise, and the people in the fire that's screaming out of the torment of the fire. In other words, is that these things are possible. And we have multiple other examples of the Prophet's interactions with the companions where they experience these realities. And this is to let us know that there's a foundation for this. And then there are great inheritors throughout the time that have preserved this. Part of the brilliance of this book that you're reading is Imam al-Ghazali laid out for us a way that we can attain that. He laid it out for us. Yani, if you do this, this is what's going to happen. And it's actually bad adab with Allah. It's actually bad adab with Allah. It's bad manners to think you can't attain something that people before you attained. It's actually bad adab. It's almost as if with that dhan, with that way of thinking about Allah, you're limiting His power. What limits His power? Nothing limits His power. He could give someone in our time what He didn't give anyone in the previous time. Ummati kal matar. My ummah is like rain. You don't know which is the best part of it, the first or the last. We don't know. And it doesn't mean, nor do we think that we deserve something, Nor does it mean that we're deluded and think that we want it when we want it and how we want it. Leave all of that. But we have to believe that this is possible. And the people of Allah, and if you remember on Friday night, we began with this meaning of husnul dhan, having a good opinion of Allah. Allah will deal with you based upon your opinion of Him. So if you come to a retreat like this, and your opinion of Allah is, Ya Rabb, you facilitated this for me, so that you can forgive my sins, so you can open up the door of understanding for me, so that you can give me abundant gifts, so that you, and just keep listing, and keep listing. And if you wanted to go on and do that for 20 minutes, and just keep listing the things that your good opinion of the Lord is that you're going to attain, Allah will give you all of that and much more from His bounty subhanahu wa ta'ala in a very real way. And the beautiful point that Sidi Abbas mentioned there about change, that is such an important point. And oftentimes practicality is relegated to the outer dimension of the human being. But in reality, is that the most practical thing you could do, i.e. the things that you could do the most that will actually change your reality outward and the reality of others, is to build substance and meaning in your heart. Because if you have a good opinion of Allah, the reality that Allah creates for you outwardly will be different than if you have a different opinion of Allah. Allah made it like this. And this is why it's so important to cultivate these meanings. So, he then says, this is possible within the essential nature of the human being, were it not for the accumulation of rust and the dross of worldly defilements on the mirror of the heart. So now he's laying out the Ghazalian way of tasawwuf. This matter is about doing acts inwardly and outwardly, embarking upon a struggle of purification, adorning your heart with virtues, ridding your heart of vices, all of which is summarized by this purificatory process of worshiping Allah Ta'ala outwardly and that purifying yourself inwardly. And what you're really doing is you're preparing your heart. In book 21 of the Ihya, which is one of the most amazing of the books, on the explanation of the wonders of the heart, he goes into great detail about the metaphor of the mirror of the heart. And this is one of the examples where Imam al-Ghazali borrows from philosophy and then naturalizes this metaphor and that uses it for the ilm tariq al-akhirah. And he talks about the 5 different reasons a mirror might not reflect something in great detail. The point is that the heart is like a mirror. It's meant to reflect. But if it has rust on that heart, and Allah Ta'ala speaks in Surah Al-Mutaffifin that was recited this morning, كَلَّا بَلْ رَانَ عَلَى قُلُوبِهِمْ. They have rust on their hearts, that مِمَّا كَانُوا يَكْسِبُونَ, from that which they've earned, the things that they've done. كَلَّا إِنَّهُمْ عَنْ رَبِّهِمْ يَوْمَئِذٍ لَمَحْجُوبُونَ. What happens when you have that rust is that on that day they will be veiled from their Lord as a result of this. So this is the whole path in its entirety. This is why we pray. This is why we fast. This is why we restrain ourselves. This is why that we do everything it is that we do, is to eventually purify the heart so that it can reflect what it was meant to reflect. So then he says, and so we mean by ilm tariq al-akhirah, we mean by the science of the path to the hereafter, the knowledge of how to polish this mirror from these impurities which are a veil between us and Allah Most High and prevent knowledge of His attributes and acts. Assuredly, the purification and cleansing of the heart are attained by renouncing desires and following the examples of the prophets, may the blessings of Allah and His peace be upon them, in all their states. Thus, commensurate with what is burnished from the heart and with its turning in the direction of the truth, realities will gleam in it. but there is no way to it save through spiritual discipline, the elucidation of which will follow in its proper place and through knowledge and learning. This knowledge is not written in books, and those who Allah bless with something of it only speak about it. Now he's going back to the understanding of the science of unveiling with the qualified who share it through oral teaching and by way of secrets. It's transmitted from heart to heart. And this shows us the importance of this reality of having in-person, real experiences, personal instruction with living masters of this tradition. Nothing is more important. If we were intelligent, yes, there's 1,001 things that need to be done for Muslims worldwide, including in these countries in which we live. But what is more important than having living examples of individuals who have connected to this chain and its realities have been realized in them? What's more important than that? That is the single most important thing in both of its forms, insofar as it relates to sacred knowledge, and then that those that are tasting that these realities, this is the most important thing of all. But these things don't come out of a void. There has to be the right environment. And if the environment is not there, then these people who he was just referring to tend to remain hidden. And they still very much are there across the world. And sometimes you will find them among you in the lands in which you live, but someone either doesn't know that they exist, or they don't think those people are them, or there's other veils that they have in relation to that, how to access them. But the reality is that they are among us still, and this is one of the things we always have to remember. As dysfunctional as things have been over the past 200 years, and especially in the past 100 years, and even in recent history in the Muslim world, and as dysfunctional that many of Muslim societies are, is it still, alhamdulillah, the remnants are significantly better than anything that we have in these countries. If you just take the family, for instance, that yes, all Muslims also are being affected by the breakdown of the nuclear family, but comparatively speaking, oh my God, that was something for me. Then I grew up in a very good family. That experiencing Muslim families firsthand in the Muslim world and still here, and that these lands, there's no comparison in terms of the way that they've clung to the way things should be. But despite all of the dysfunctionality and everything that's transpired in the Muslim world, we never can forget there's more people who've attained knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and become close to Him on the hands of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, men and women alike, spanning the ethnicities of earth throughout the centuries, than the ummah of our Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And that continues to remain the case. There are still a large number of arifin billah, knowers of Allah, men and women. The internal hierarchy of the awliya is perfectly preserved. Even though externally, the further that you get away from the time of prophecy, things tend to get watered down. We always have to remember that. And it's a living tradition because it is the tree of Islam. And Allah speaks about this. The kalima tayyiba is like a shajara tayyiba, asluha thabit. Its foundations, which are rooted in revelation, are firmly planted and grounded. The de-centered, uprooted human beings of our time don't have access to this. And that precisely the way that trees work, that they don't absorb much moisture from the rain. The rain goes into the earth, and then the roots are what actually that send the nourishment to the rest of the tree. تُؤْتِي أُكُلَهَا كُلَّ حِينٍ بِإِذْنِ رَبِّهَا. Because the living tree of Islam is very much alive, it will give the fruit of every season by the leave of its Lord. And this is something that you and I need to connect to. And that's the purpose here, is that we understand this exists, and then let's spend our time with its true people. So this is what he says about ilm al-mukashfa. And then he stops, and then ultimately he says that This is not something that I'm going to speak about in this book, other than just little glimpses here and there, sense kind of here and there. So we know this exists to motivate us to renew our resolve when we become weak, to put this knowledge of ilm al-mu'amala into practice. Now, he then, if we would analyze these passages, that we can say the following. These are just some insights here. We can come to the following conclusion about the relationship between ilm al-mu'amala and ilm al-mukashafa. So outward knowledge and inward knowledge, just keep it simple like that. That outward knowledge is the foundation upon which inward knowledge is built, and thus must be the first focus of study and practice. And this is really important. So there's a beautiful hadith of our Prophet where he speaks about the different levels of meaning of the Quran. Every verse of the Quran has a dhahrun wa batnun wa haddun wa matla or muttala. Every verse of the Quran has an outward meaning, an inward meaning, a limit, and a rising point, matla, or a muttala, a vantage point. And from here is the only way to access true inner knowledge is through the sacred law. Any inner knowledge that comes by way of deviating from the sacred law is that was from shaitan. They're whisperings from the devil. True knowledge, inner knowledge, only comes from establishing the outward. And this is very important because this allows us to ground ourselves. And so, ilm al-mu'amala is the foundation. At the same time, outward knowledge and inward knowledge, ilm al-mu'amala and al-mukashafa, are interdependent. In other words, they amplify one another. The more that we learn about what we need to do, the more that Allah Ta'ala gives, and then the more that Allah Ta'ala gives us, then the more that enables us to do more. So you can see the same thing in the breakdown of Islam, Ihsan, Iman, Islam, and Ihsan. So depending on how we look at it, obviously Iman is the foundation of everything. If you don't have Iman, there's no reality to Islam, even though that we can speak of Islam in a sense, and it's mentioned in Hadith Gabriel that it's actually first, and when it first is submission. But if we look at it from this perspective, Iman is the foundation. And to the degree of our faith is to the degree to which we will act. But every time that you act, is that there's a light, the light of faith increases in your heart. And then likewise, is that when you move up to the degree of ihsan, the more ihsan that you have, then the better that you're going to, the better your Islam is going to be, and the better of your Iman. So Iman and Islam are the foundation of ihsan, but then ihsan helps you to perfect your Iman and your Islam, if that makes sense. So they're interdependent. And the same thing here, if you refer to it as these two different realities of ilm tariq al-akhirah. And then he says here, ilm al-mu'amala and ilm al-mukashafa, well actually this is not his words, these are just just a brief analysis of this, is that they're not equal. They're not equal. Rather, ilm al-mu'amala is subordinate to ilm al-mukashafa, just as the outward dimension of ilm al-mu'amala is subordinate to the inward dimension. And this is going to become very important, as we will see when we talk about the architecture of the Ihya and how it relates to reviving the religious sciences, which is the essence of what he's trying to do, and then the progression in the Ihya. And so they're not equal. It doesn't mean that Ibn Amma is bad. No, this is great. But what it means is that ilm al-mukashafa is what we actually seek. So it has a higher station and status. And then the goal of the deen is to experience ilm al-mukashafa. And thus, it is of the greatest eschatological and soteriological significance. Fancy words, meaning that in relation to our salvation and what we experience in the hereafter, khalas. And when we look at the breakdown, Imam al-Ghazali that clearly is intending this with how he laid this book out. So having said that, if we look at the next point in the outline, which are the we're going to focus now more on ilm al-mu'amala. So the fancy translation for ilm al-mu'amala is the knowledge of praxis, right? But really, it's just, let's just think of this as that how it is, the knowledge that we need to focus on in order to achieve what it is that can be achieved. And so now we have to actually go back to the introduction again. And so Imam Ghazali says that وَلَقَدْ أَسَّسْتُ عَلَى أَرْبَعَةِ أَرْبَعَ. He says that he broke down this Ihya into 4 quarters. And the 4 quarters are رُبع العبادات والعادات والمهلكات والمنجيات. So there's the first quarter, which he says is the quarter on worship. Then you have the quarter on customs, and we'll explain what that means. Then you have the quarter on destructive vices, and then you have the quarter on saving virtues. And so now this is a quote, Ilm al-Mu'amala is divided into outward knowledge, by which I mean knowledge of the bodily actions, and inward knowledge, by which I mean knowledge of the actions of the heart. The members of the body either perform acts of worship or acts that are in accordance with custom. What he means by custom here is that the word adat, ada yu'udu, is something that you return to. So not custom in the sense of, oh, this is just a family tradition to have pancakes on Saturday. That these are things that you return to time and time again, the adat. And that you could also say dealings and the things that we need. So things like eating, things like travel, things like marriage, things like financial transactions, things like knowledge of the halal and the haram, and so forth and so on. And then he ends the second quarter with a beautiful, that exposition of the prophetic character, which is essentially like a book of Shama'il. And then he says, while what transpires in the heart, because it is shrouded from the senses and belongs to the spiritual realm, is either praiseworthy or blameworthy. Therefore, it is necessary that this science divide into 2 parts, and in tariq al-akhirah, outward and inward. The outward part, which is connected to the limbs, is subdivided into acts of worship and acts that pertain to custom. The inward part, which is connected to the states of the heart and the characteristics of the soul, is subdivided into what is blameworthy and praiseworthy. All of them together form 4 divisions, and any investigation into ilm al-mu'amala will not go outside of these divisions. So he just gives us the whole breakdown of the whole book. And that essentially the Ihya al-Din is 40 volumes, even though he calls them books. And there's 4 sets of 10 books. And the first 10 tend to focus on worship. Now, he uses this loosely because you'll find in the first 10, obviously book 1 is the book on knowledge. Book 2 is the book on creed. Then that book 3, where he starts to get into purification. Book 4, he starts to get into prayer and hakada. So he does include that an entire book on belief, where he speaks of belief in 2 different levels, because this is needed. And this will become clear when we mention this last bit here. How does this breakdown, this structure of the Ihya al-Din, now relate to then ilm tariq al-akhirah? And so that his conception of ilm tariq al-akhirah, that includes both correct belief and correct practice in its outward and inward form. And if we would briefly go through this, Book 1 defines this knowledge. So Book 1 introduces everything that's going to come. And that it's so significant what he does in Book 1. Because he is tying knowledge, and of course what he means by this, sacred religious knowledge, to ilm tariq al-akhirah. And he's essentially saying that if you stray from this understanding, it's not actually really considered to be knowledge. And I hope that just became clear and evident when what Shaykh Yasser was speaking about yesterday. And when Imam Ghazali is saying what he said about the fuqaha and the mutakallimin, there's obviously things that he doesn't mean by that. He doesn't mean that you don't study ilm al-kalam. Book 2 is all about ilm al-kalam. Yani. It doesn't mean that you don't study fiqh. There's fiqh throughout the Ihya. There's fiqh in the book of Tahara, fiqh in the book of Salat, but it's not the focus. He only gives you what it is that you need to travel the path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And keep in mind as well that he points to in later books, for instance, like in Jawahir al-Quran, to his iqtisad fil i'tiqad. So it doesn't mean that he says that you don't study that. What he's given you is a way of being, and that way of being what is actually going to truly define if you're a person of knowledge, not necessarily what you know, if that makes sense. In other words, that it's living the way that the early people truly lived is what constitutes true knowledge. Now, one of the things we didn't talk about was the relationship of in tariq al-akhirah to tajdeed. And we don't have time, so maybe we'll speak about that. We'll try to fit that in sometime tomorrow. And this is really, really important. And Imam al-Ghazali was told by one of the righteous of his time, and he was well aware that he was the main mujaddid of his time. And anyhow, we'll save that conversation for tomorrow. So book 1 defines this knowledge. Book 2 lays the foundation for beliefs. Books 3 through 20 establish the foundations for correct worship. Books 3 to 10 establish the foundations for correct worship. Books 11 to 20 for correct dealings. And then at this point, from books 21 to books 40, the progression is found in tasawwuf, the inner travel of the heart. And so you have, as some pointed out, there was a progression in the different chapters. And this is what you could say, it's a fancy word, that a teleological progression. But if you were going to give a definition to this science, one way of defining it, you could call it a teleological discipline. That's a fancy word that simply means you focus on the end. It's a teleological discipline devoted to the systematic preparation of the individual soul for his encounter, for the ultimate encounter with Allah. This is what he's trying to do. And why is this so important? Because this is the purpose of life. He is preparing you to fulfill your purpose in life. And his critique is, there are people who have gone astray from this, sometimes in the name of religion. It's understood that people that don't have deen are going to go astray and be far from the mark. But he says is that because religious people are the greatest way that other people actually go astray, it's more serious when this is the case with religious people. And so the whole point is that he wants us to be aware of what it is that we need to really prepare for the meeting with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this applies to how it is that we approach deen. And we will, inshallah ta'ala, in the next session, quote a beautiful passage from the Book of Assistance by Imam Haddad, laying out clearly what beneficial knowledge is. This has to be the knowledge that we're rooted in. And yes, if you dip into studying other things, that's fine. But all of that is guided by immersion in beneficial knowledge and preparing for the meeting with Allah. How does this relate to other aspects of our lives? It relates to decision making. Yani, whenever we come to doing anything that we want to do, thinking that thing through, understanding the consequences of the different choices that we might make. What is it going to do for us? Is it going to move us closer to this reality or more distant? Decisions that we make in relation to our career, the way that we approach how it is that we structure our time, the way it is that we run an organization. Understanding the principles of tariq al-akhirah don't just benefit us in this specific sense of how it is that we approach the learning of the deen. It actually applies to everything that it is that we do in life and the various decisions that we make in our personal lives and those of our family, community, and anything that is connected to us, whether it be an institution or anything else. All of these things, that there's ways of approaching it. And in a sense, you could summarize it by saying it is a methodology. And we as human beings are in need of a methodology. If you don't have a methodology, your life will be haphazard. Things will arise, and it's very likely that unfortunately end up going the wrong. You have to have a methodology. And a methodology will help you throughout your life maintain your principles, and despite the challenges that come your way and the fitan and the trials and tribulations that you experience, it will allow you to stay grounded. Another way of looking at that is that it will allow you to be rooted in your unchanging principles in times of very severe changing circumstances. And anyone who's lived long enough, and I'm getting old enough, I think, to say this, that, Uncle, not as long as you, but I am getting older, to say this, is that you see people that don't have a methodology, things happen, and then things change. And what we want is an approach to the deen. And this is why you have to take it from the right people. And it takes sometimes a while for this to be available in places like England, in places like America, in the West, where someone in the early period of their life, in their teens, in their early 20s, they can stay afloat and maintain a state of uprightness. So for some people, it's the early years that get them. Other people, they're fine until they get married, and then that's when all the problems happen. Other people, they're fine when they're young, or it could work the other way around, but they're fine when they get married, but then they have children. For some people, children make it very difficult for them. For others, it's when their children get to teenagers. For other people, it's when they reach the ages of quote-unquote midlife crisis. For other people, it's older. But having an approach to the deen that is holistic and can give you guidance at every stage of your life, so that you do the right thing at the right time, in the right way, with perfect balance. That's what we want. We don't want people moving forward to say, oh my God, I wasted 10 years of my life, or I wasted 20 years of my life. But this is taken from the real people of this deen who have balanced between everything. And there are some ways and approaches that tend to be like a donkey going around the mill. You forget in the process what this whole thing is all about, and you lose so much in that process. Whereas the people that have taken books like this seriously and then appropriated them, internalized their meanings such that it has become a part of their tradition, and then have spread this religion to the corners of the earth over that 1,000 plus years in different environments, as that civilizations rise and fall, as governments rise and fall, as this tribulation comes and that tribulation comes, and this goes and that goes, and this is what we want to be a part of. And this, nothing is more needed in our lands than that. And this is what we hope, that there's the first signs of it being extended to these blessed lands. And what will happen is, once this is available, that you will find that people have a remarkable ability to achieve incredible heights in a very short period of time and remain there for the entirety of their lives from the bounty of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. At the heart of all of that is this: ilm tariq al-akhirah, knowledge, the science of the path to the hereafter. It directly relates to everything. That there were some things I wish we could have got to, but we couldn't. But inshallah ta'ala, we can follow up for any details in our interactive sessions tonight. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us knowledge and give us understanding, and to give us wisdom, and to bring light to our hearts. Ya Arhamar Rahimeen. to benefit us in these sessions profoundly, Ya Arhamar Rahimeen. May our portion not just be the movement of our tongues, but may these meanings penetrate our hearts. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala open up the door for us to understand ilm al-mu'amala and bless us solely from His bounty and generosity with something of ilm al-mukasha, but at least love those people, Ya Rahman, that you've granted this knowledge to. May Allah ta'ala protect us and preserve us and take care of all of our affairs, Ya Arhamar Rahimeen. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam, walhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.
وجد بالنوال منه إليّ